I stepped into Eastbrook Chapel. The quiet hum of voices and the soft toll of the organ pressing against my chest. The scent of lilies and polished wood filled the air, mingling with the faint perfume of people who had come to mourn Elliot. I clutched my black dress around me, feeling its familiar weight, and my purse felt heavier than usual. A small anchor against the sinking feeling in my stomach. My eyes immediately found her. Jenna Brooks? Seated in the front row with an air of certainty, her dark curls falling perfectly over her shoulders, the black dress chosen with calculated care. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, shoulders trembling as if she belonged there, as if she had the right to occupy the space that had always been mine. The ushers treated her gently, patting her shoulder, guiding her attention toward the casket as though she were the widow. I glanced toward Nathan, my son, who stood near the entrance. His expression was a mixture of confusion and discomfort, his jaw tight as if he had already recognized the injustice unfolding before him. He didn't meet my eyes, but the way he shifted uneasily told me he knew something was off. I moved slowly down the aisle, keeping my gaze fixed on Jenna for a brief moment before letting it drift over the pews. People whispered, nodded politely, and wiped their eyes, but no one truly saw me. I wasn't on the program. I hadn't been asked to speak. The service had been arranged without me. And yet, I had to be here. I had to witness how my place, our life together, had been quietly erased. I paused at the back, letting the pews separate me from the front, feeling the weight of decades of love and sacrifice compressed into a single, unacknowledged moment. The casket gleamed under the sunlight streaming through the stained glass, and I realized I was standing on the outside of a life I had helped build. My gaze drifted to the doorway, and I braced myself for what came next. I remained at the back of the chapel, letting the soft murmur of voices wash over me. People whispered condolences, nodded politely as they passed, and cast uncertain glances, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. It was the kind of polite attention reserved for strangers, and I felt it sting more sharply than any insult could have cut. My gaze drifted to Nathan again. He fidgeted with the edge of his tie, shifting from foot to foot, a subtle display of unease. He wasn't ignoring me completely, but neither was he stepping forward to claim my place, to acknowledge that this space should have been mine. I realized then that the funeral had been orchestrated without my input, arranged to maintain a picture-perfect version of Elliot's life that excluded me entirely. My daughter's insistence that I needed rest suddenly felt like something far more deliberate. I thought about the decades I had poured into this family, the quiet sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, the mornings I had risen early to prepare breakfasts while Elliot slept, the nights spent soothing Nathan through fevers and heartaches. Every small gesture, every act of devotion, had built a life that now seemed invisible to the very people I loved most. The air in the chapel felt heavier, pressing me down as I confronted the reality I had resisted for months. The crowd, the ceremony, the careful placement of faces, all of it reinforced the truth I had long feared I was on the outside, observing the life I had helped construct without permission. And as the organ softened and the murmurs faded, I felt a quiet determination settle in, knowing I had to see this through to the very moment the truth would be revealed. The first cracks were almost imperceptible. Elliot began texting quietly on his phone, tilting the screen away when I entered the room. He lingered at the clinic longer than usual, offering vague explanations about emergencies or extra patients. Some nights, he would come home and collapse onto the couch without so much as a glance my way. I told myself it was stress, fatigue, nothing more than the demands of his growing practice. When I noticed the perfume subtle, floral, unfamiliar, I convinced myself it was a candle from the waiting room or something a patient had left behind. The small inconsistencies stacked slowly, each one tiny enough to rationalize a missed dinner, a brushed-off question, a quiet phone call in another room. I clung to the stability I knew, the life we had built, telling myself that my imagination was running wild. I replayed moments in my mind, analyzing every glance and every word. Perhaps it was just work. Perhaps he was tired. Perhaps I was reading too much into nothing. I made excuses for him because acknowledging the truth would have shattered the fragile equilibrium I had constructed over decades. And yet, a quiet unease persisted. A whisper in the back of my mind that something was shifting beyond repair. The laughter we shared over crosswords, the small daily rituals, the effortless closeness they were slowly eroding in ways I couldn't name. The life I thought was steady, predictable, and shared was becoming foreign to me, piece by piece, without confrontation or declaration. By the time I realized that these subtle changes were not accidents, that the warmth and attention I had once counted on were being redirected elsewhere, I felt the first real stirrings of betrayal. And in that uneasy recognition, I braced myself for the truth that I had long been avoiding. I had always trusted Elliot, always believed in the life we had built together, but the truth arrived in fragments I could no longer ignore. I found the first message on his phone while he was out of the house, a casual notification that opened like a knife. Missed you today. Call when you can. It was signed with a name I didn't recognize, Jenna. My hands shook as I read it, trying to convince myself it was nothing, that it could be a mistake or some innocent miscommunication. Over the following days, I noticed the little things stacking up. A small jewelry box left accidentally on the kitchen counter, an unfamiliar scarf folded neatly in the laundry, receipts for spa treatments, and dinners at restaurants I had never heard him mention. Each item whispered the same truth: he had carved out a secret world, one in which I was absent, replaced by someone else. I began to document quietly, making mental notes of dates, gifts, messages, and encounters that no one else would notice. It was not an act of revenge, but a way to anchor myself, to keep track of the life I had thought we shared. Every discovery twisted my chest tighter. The thoughtful gestures I had once considered ours were being given to another, someone younger, someone he had chosen to hold close in ways he no longer held me. The betrayal was not sudden. It was cumulative, a slow realization that the foundation of my life had shifted beneath me without a sound. I felt hollow, disoriented, and yet a strange clarity emerged amidst the heartbreak. The evidence was undeniable. The warmth, attention, and care I had given freely had been redirected elsewhere, and I was forced to reckon with the reality that the man I loved and the life I had trusted had quietly moved on from me long before I even suspected it. By the time I set the phone down and stared at the quiet house around me, I understood that there was no returning to the illusions of yesterday. This knowledge settled in my bones, heavy and unyielding, and I realized that the next steps I took would not be dictated by shock or despair. They would be deliberate, controlled, and entirely my own. The house felt emptier than I had ever remembered. Days blurred together, each one a repetition of quiet steps and muted echoes. I stopped preparing elaborate meals, letting breakfast slip past entirely. Sometimes even lunch. Sleep became both refuge and trap. 10, 12 hours a night, lying under the blankets as if hiding from the reality that had settled into every corner of my life. I wandered from room to room, noticing details I had never considered before: the crease of a pillow, the faint smell of antiseptic from the clinic, the dust gathering on the bookshelf where Elliot's awards sat untouched. It was in these small observations that I began to realize how much of myself I had ceded to a life that now felt foreign. Slowly, I began small acts of reclamation. I dug out my journal from the bottom drawer, running a pen across its pages for the first time in years. I wrote without aim, letting memories and feelings pour onto the paper, unfiltered, unjudged. I rearranged a few pieces of furniture, not for decoration, but to reclaim the rhythm of my space. The laundry, the dishes, the cluttered counters all became silent exercises in taking back control, tiny markers of agency in a world that had felt decided for me. Each deliberate action, each quiet choice, carried a growing sense of purpose. I wasn't acting out of revenge. I was preparing for the moment when the truth would no longer be something I whispered to myself in the solitude of my kitchen. Preparing to confront the reality of what Elliot had done and what it meant for me, for my sense of self. In the stillness, a clarity emerged that I hadn't known I possessed. I was not powerless. I had survived decades of devotion, and I would not disappear quietly into someone else's narrative. I would take the steps necessary to reclaim my presence, my voice, and my life. Even if the first act was simply standing still and acknowledging the betrayal I had long feared. I stood at the back of the chapel, the polished wooden floors reflecting the soft light streaming through the stained glass. My hands were clasped tightly in front of me, knuckles white, as Father Keegan cleared his throat and prepared to speak. Jenna sat rigid in the front row, a handkerchief pressed to her trembling face, exuding the calm certainty of someone who believed she belonged there. Nathan's eyes flicked toward me briefly, conflicted, betraying the unease I had already sensed. The organ softened, and the murmurs of the congregation died down. I could feel every pair of eyes on the front rows, yet none on me. I had been a shadow for too long, invisible in the space I had helped build. Then Father Keegan spoke, his voice calm and steady, carrying across the chapel. Before we begin, I have an announcement from Elliot Weller's legal spouse. The words hit like a quiet explosion. I felt the gaze of the entire congregation pivot toward me. Dozens of heads turning, eyes widening in surprise. Jenna's hand froze mid-dab to her eyes. Her composure wavered for the first time, the confidence she had worn like armor cracking in an instant. Nathan's jaw tightened, his discomfort now visible to everyone. I stepped forward, my movements deliberate, unhurried. I felt the weight of every year, every sacrifice, every quiet morning and sleepless night settle into my shoulders, lending strength I hadn't realized I had. I did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, letting the gravity of the moment anchor the truth. Then I took the podium, placing my hands firmly on its edge. My name is Marissa Caldwell, I said, voice calm, steady, carrying over the hush of the chapel. I was married to Elliot Weller for over 35 years. I was his partner, his wife, and the mother of his child. I am here as his legal spouse. The shift in the room was immediate. Faces turned fully toward me, murmurs of confusion and recognition spreading like ripples. Jenna's lips parted slightly, and her hands dropped to her lap. Nathan's eyes met mine briefly, a silent acknowledgement of what had been overlooked for so long. In that moment, I felt the years of invisibility lift, replaced by a quiet vindication. The space I had once occupied by his side, and that had been stolen from me, was finally acknowledged. I did not need applause or recognition. The truth had spoken for itself, and I was seen again. As the organ began to play softly and the service continued, I stepped back from the podium, letting the awareness of my presence settle around me, ready to confront the next chapter of what had been hidden and what I now would reclaim. The next morning, I met with Paula, my attorney. In the office where Elliot and I had once reviewed our wills together, the memory of those conversations made the sterile walls feel both familiar and alien. I laid out my intentions calmly, deliberately, choosing my words with care. I wanted everything in Elliot's estate, including the clinic, to pass to me as the legal spouse. I requested that Jenna be removed from any position she held under the assumption of entitlement. Paula listened attentively, taking notes, asking precise questions to ensure there would be no ambiguity. The legal documents were meticulous, covering every account, every asset, every corner of the estate. I did not rush, nor did I allow emotion to override judgment. Each decision was considered logical and deliberate. I signed forms, reviewed statements, and confirmed the steps necessary to transfer authority fully into my hands. For the first time in months, I felt a quiet power settle over me, a sense of order returning to the chaos that had been my life. Once the legal work was in motion, I focused on the clinic. Jenna had operated there as if she owned it, making decisions, directing staff, claiming authority. I coordinated a quiet exit, informing her that her volunteer position had ended immediately. The process was precise, professional, and conducted without spectacle. No one needed to witness her removal, and I made certain it was handled without conflict. It was not about punishment. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully mine. As the clinic staff adjusted, I began to feel the first real sense of control in months. The years of invisibility, the quiet displacements, the subtle erasure of my presence. It all began to reverse under the weight of deliberate action. I was not acting out of vengeance, but out of necessity, asserting the authority that had always been mine. By the time I left the office that afternoon, documents in hand and plans finalized, I felt steadier, more grounded. Each step I had taken had been intentional, a reclamation of space and power that had been quietly taken from me. I walked out into the sunlight, feeling the shift in the air, aware that the next moves would not only secure what I had lost, but also define the boundaries of the life I would continue to build. I invited Nathan to the kitchen one evening, asking him to sit with me at the table we had once shared so many meals as a family. He hesitated at first, shifting uneasily on the chair, as if unsure whether he was allowed into the space I had reclaimed. I looked at him steadily, my hands resting on the table, and began speaking plainly, without accusation or anger. I need you to understand something. I said, for decades, I built this family alongside your father. Every choice, every sacrifice, every quiet act of care was part of that effort. I stayed up nights worrying, worked long days to make sure we had a home, and held this family together through everything. It was never about being seen or praised. It was about keeping us whole. Nathan's expression softened, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He listened, quietly, letting my words settle. I know, Mom, he said finally, voice low. I didn't realize how much you carried alone. I thought things were normal, that Dad had it all under control, and I didn't see the weight you bore. We talked for hours, revisiting memories both bitter and sweet. I shared the small ways I had kept the household running, the quiet work that often went unnoticed, and the ways I had tried to remain present while being pushed aside emotionally. Nathan admitted his blind spots, the times he had followed appearances instead of questioning them, and the moments he had failed to advocate for the person who had always been at the center of their lives. By the end of the evening, there was a sense of understanding that had been absent for years. Not every word needed to be perfect, and not every apology fully expressed. What mattered was the acknowledgement, the recognition of a mother's sacrifices, and a son's willingness to listen. As Nathan stood to leave, he paused, meeting my eyes. There was a quiet promise in that look, a subtle acknowledgement that the bond between us could be strengthened, rebuilt, and understood on new terms. And as he walked toward the door, I felt the first real shift in our relationship since the funeral, a shift that would carry forward into the life I was now determined to reclaim. The days after Nathan's visit felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. I began filling my hours with things I had long neglected, the small pursuits that once seemed secondary to a life built around everyone else. I pulled my old sketchbooks from the shelf, the pages yellowed with age, and began drawing again. Simple, still lifes, flowers, and the occasional landscape reminded me that I could create something that belonged entirely to me. Journaling became a quiet ritual. Each morning, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of strong coffee, letting my thoughts flow onto the page, unfiltered and unjudged. I wrote about the past, yes, but also about what I wanted for the future, the kind of days I hoped to live, the small acts of freedom I intended to claim. I found satisfaction in arranging my home, in planting herbs and flowers in the backyard, and in letting routines serve me instead of the expectations of others. I volunteered at the local library, assisting with story time for children. Their laughter and boundless energy reminded me that life could be joyful, and that purpose could be found outside the roles I had once defined by others. I joined a community sketching group, meeting new people who shared my interests, whose conversation did not revolve around Elliot, Jenna, or the quiet betrayals I had endured. I visited Elliot's grave less out of longing and more as a marker of what had been and what had passed. I left flowers, sometimes quietly whispered memories, and walked away without lingering. The grief remained, but it no longer dictated my days or stole my peace. I had learned to carry the memory without letting it control me. In the quiet moments, I realized that the life I was now living was one I had consciously chosen. Autonomy replaced obligation, and joy was no longer contingent on recognition or approval. I moved through each day with deliberate attention, feeling the pulse of my own presence in ways I had long forgotten. And as I closed my sketchbook one evening, the pages filled with color and thought, I understood that this was not merely rebuilding, it was becoming the version of myself I had always wanted to know, fully present, fully seen, and fully alive.